My kid was not amused when he thought it was chocolate and I told him he could try it and it tasted like meat. So just beware. Hi there. Today we are going to be making one of my absolute favorite treats, Pemmican. Now, you may not know what Pemmican is, so let me quickly explain to you so that you have an understanding of what exactly you're going to be getting yourself into today. So, Pemmican is an ancestral protein bar. It originated with the indigenous people of North America, and it is made from dried meat, which has been ground down into a powder, and then fat gets added to this powder to make a paste. They oftentimes would add fruit, like dried fruit or nuts to change up the flavor and give it some different texture, but it's not necessary to add that in there. Pemmican is shelf stable if you make it correctly. So it could last for hundreds of years. Great for a disaster kit. Great for taking when you go camping or hiking. But personally, I just love it. I love to have it on hand just for a snack. I like to keep mine in the freezer. That's how I get that texture of a cookie. Absolutely find it delicious. So, that's what we're going to be making today, some pemmican. Now, I am just a simple girl living a carnivore lifestyle. I do not eat the nuts and the fruit, so that's not something I'm going to be adding into my pemmican. However, I am not going to stop you from adding it into yours. So I will be adding something to my pemmican to give it a different texture as well, but mine will be an animal-based product, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. I absolutely love pemmican, and I show it off a lot on social media through X and through Instagram. Feel free to follow me over there if you want to see what I'm eating every day, especially on X. I'm a lot more active over there, but I'm trying to stay active on Instagram as well. But because I show off the pemmican so much, I constantly get questioned about it. People want to know what it is, how it tastes, how to make it. And so I figured it's time to finally share a video of how I actually make this wonderful treat. So when I explain to people what it's like, it looks like a piece of chocolate. It has the texture of a cookie when it's frozen, but it tastes like a delicious piece of meat. So if you're a meat lover like me, you will absolutely love these two. First, we need to go over a few things that you will need before we get started. You're going to need a dehydrator or a multi-purpose appliance in the kitchen that has a dehydrator function on it. That's what I'm going to be using. I have two different Ninja appliances that both have a dehydrate function, and that's what I will be using. Or if your oven gets low enough, you could potentially dehydrate your meat in the oven. Probably gonna have to have one that goes as low as 165. I will be dehydrating at 150 today. 165 would be fine, maybe up to 180. I'm not 100% sure on that. You just have to keep an eye on it. Okay. In addition to the dehydrator, you are going to need a kitchen scale. So the importance of the kitchen scale, like this one I've got right here, is because we're going to have to weigh our meat powder and our fat out evenly. It is an equal ratio of the powder to the fat itself. You're also going to need silicone molds. Now I've got several different options to show you. These are how I get them looking like cookies. So I've got all kinds. So you can go with the round ones, which would be a traditional cookie shape, obviously, from the muffin tin. I love these square ones. I think this was called it was like a brownie pan or something like that to make individual brownies. I love this. This has become one of my absolute favorites that I use all the time. You also can use silicone ice trays. This one I have got little shell shapes. This one I have got flamingos. And then today I picked up some little Valentine ones where I could make them look like little chocolates, which is perfect because pemmican does look like chocolate. Just be careful not to trick your friends with it unless you just want to. All right, so along with the dehydrator and the scale, the silicone molds, you're also going to need a food processor. Now, I highly recommend using a high-powered one if you've got it, that will just completely blitz this meat, dried meat, into just a completely nice, fine, powdery dust. I do not have a high-powered one, so for me, I've got, I will be using a food processor to break it down initially, and then I will be using a coffee grinder or a spice grinder to blitz it up into a really fine meat dust. Now, the ingredients that you're going to need to make this pemmican. Now, we are talking about making it shelf stable this time around. I have another video coming out that we will make it with fattier meat. We will actually use ground beef, and they will not be shelf stable. They will just be for a nice treat. So I want to make sure that you understand, if you're going to make this shelf stable, you need to have very lean beef. I will be using a London broil. You could also use a very lean sirloin steak. You could use lean stew meat. Anything that is super, super lean. Even the shaved beef that you can get to make like a Philly cheesesteak sandwich, those are very, very lean, and they're already super thin, so that's easy to dehydrate. So these are all great options for this. You're going to need, you're going to need your lean beef. You're going to need tallow rendered from beef suet. Now, suet is the fat from around the kidneys. It is important that you use suet instead of just regular tallow that's been rendered from the rest of the fat, because it has a lot more stearic acid in it, and it solidifies really well at room temperature. But the tallow from suet is almost like a candle wax texture at room temperature, whereas the regular tallow is more like a softened butter where it's spreadable. Suet is not spreadable. So you want that suet for it to be stable at room temperature. You're also going to need salt. I like to use Redmond's real salt. I also personally love sprinkling some smoked salt onto this when it's done. Towards the end. So it's very simple, 3 ingredients. So very simple thing to make. It is just time consuming because you've got to spend the time dehydrating, you've got to spend time freezing it. But aside from that, it's very easy, it's very simple. All right, so let's get started. For this batch of pemmican, we're going to be using just under 2.5 pounds of top round London broil. This one I got on sale because it was coming close to the sell-by date. That is a wonderful time to purchase meat if you have a freezer with freezer space, or if you're planning on using it immediately. A perfectly respectable piece of meat for an amazing price. So we're going to start with drying off our meat. Just blot it with a paper towel and get it dried off so that you can work with it a little bit easier. Now you'll notice it's a very lean piece of meat, but I do have some fat still on it. And we want to take care of that fat because when we dehydrate this meat, we want it to be as dry as possible. And if you leave any extra fat on there, it's going to be very hard to dry it out. That fat, it holds moisture in it, and it will not dry the way the lean beef will. So we're going to go ahead and trim off our fat pieces that we have on here. It's probably the only time you're ever going to see me trimming off any fat is when I'm making pemmican, because fat is a very important part of my diet. I will not be wasting these little bits that I'm cutting off. I'm actually going to save these and eat them. I'll cook them up with my lunch and eat them so that nothing goes to waste. So once we've got all of the fat trimmed off of there, we've got our nice lean piece of beef. it is now time to start slicing into very thin slices. The thinner the slice, the better. And this is so that it will dry nicely in the dehydrator. Now, this is a great time to talk about what you're using to cut the meat. You are going to want your knife to be extremely sharp. So either freshly sharpen it before you start cutting, or just make sure that your knives are kept sharp that you have in the kitchen at all times. It is not good for your knives to let them get dull. So make sure you're sharpening them regularly. Once we get this sliced, you'll see that I'm starting to put these onto my dehydrating rack. You do not want to overlap these. It's okay if they are so close together that they touch, but you do not want them overlapping. Now, as I've been cutting, I noticed that the meat, it's getting a little bit hard to keep the slices thin. So I decided to stick it in the freezer for about 10 to 15 minutes to let it firm up, just so it would be a little bit easier to slice those really thin slices. You'll notice here it's much easier for me to slice those thin slices because the meat has gotten a bit firmer. I decided to go ahead and cut the meat into smaller portions so that I could have smaller pieces to slice that would fit nicer on my dehydrating racks. So while I was working on one piece, I put the other piece back in the freezer so that it would be nice and firm by the time I got to it. None of this meat was frozen solid. Just about 15 minutes is all it takes. It's just enough that it's firm enough to be able to get these really, really nice slices. All right, so I like to go ahead and salt these before I put them in the dehydrator. So I did salt each layer that I have right here in this little rack that I've got going on. And then I've got one more rack to fill up. This was a lot of meat for my small appliances that I use for dehydrating. So if you have a big dehydrator, you will have a lot easier time than I did, but I did just fine with it. So you'll see it's a process. There's lots of cutting and then taking the time to lay them out. And once again, you'll notice I've got all of the meat laid out. It's very close together, but none of it is overlapped. Finally coming to the end of slicing here, and you will see I've got this rack completely filled. I'm going to go ahead and salt it. I've got just a little bit of meat that wouldn't quite fit there on my dehydrating rack, and I've got a plan for that too. So here I am salting it up, and then we're going to pop these in the dehydrator. All right, so there it is. We're going to put it in the dehydrator. I promise this thing is clean. I use it all the time though, so there is a lot of dark areas on here where it has been just, used and used and used. My little pieces that I couldn't fit on the dehydrator rack, I put on the sear plate in the bottom. I figure it's going to be fine. They're just small pieces. I'm going to flip them over in a couple of hours. And then once the meat kind of shrinks a little from dehydrating, I can move them up onto the dehydrating rack with the rest of the meat. But for now, it's just going to start in the bottom down there. So I'm going to set my dehydrator to 150, and I set it for 10 hours, but in reality, I let it go for about 15 hours. So just keep that in mind. It's going to be a process. It just takes time to wait for it to get really, really dry. So again, here I am putting my other rack into my Ninja Foodie. I'm gonna set it to dehydrate to 150 degrees. And then again for 10 hours, but like I said before, it did go in for a total of 15 hours. Okay, so we have got our dried meat here from dehydrating. And I'm going to show you, it's very, very dry. Comes apart pretty easily. Even our thicker pieces, very crispy and dry. All right, so we're going to blitz this up into a powder. Now, I do not have a super high power food processor that will get these into just absolute powder. So my secret weapon is the coffee grinder. And once I have used this to blitz them into nice tiny pieces, I'm then going to use the coffee grinder and turn them into dust. I find that the finer you can get the powder, the better the texture of the meat cookie will turn out. Okay, so here we go. We are just using the food processor, like I said, and turning this into a fairly coarse powder. Here's what it looks like. I'm gonna set this aside and I'm gonna repeat the process with the rest of the dried meat that I have on these racks. And then once all of that is ground down into this version of powder, I'm going to then move to the coffee grinder or the spice grinder. And I'm going to be working in small batches because obviously it's a very small area in this little machine. So just a few scoops of meat powder at a time. And I will be blitzing this into a nice fine powder. Now, you can go ahead and laugh. I broke the button off of my coffee grinder, so I have to start it with a pair of scissors. But hey, it still works and I'm good with that. So we're just gonna kind of give it a minute to turn into a nice fine powder. As it gets finer and finer, it starts to stick to itself. So you'll notice I kind of stop and shake it a few times. It's because that powder likes to stick to itself once it gets really nice and fine. So I'm going to show you the difference in texture here between the first batch that I did in the food processor and then the second batch after it's been through the coffee grinder. So this first one, it's very coarse and kind of sandy, whereas the second one, it actually kind of sticks together because it's so fine. It almost reminds me of kinetic sand, if you've ever seen that. So now it's time to weigh our meat dust and our tallow. You will notice we had 300 grams of meat dust, so we had to weigh out 300 grams of tallow from suet. Then I'm going to take that suet and I'm going to pour it into a saucepan over low heat. Now, you will notice that this tallow has already started to solidify just from being at room temperature in this glass pitcher. So that's why we're turning this on low heat. We're not trying to cook anything at this point. We are just trying to keep our tallow liquid. We don't want it to solidify right now. So once we've got all of our tallow that is liquid again, there's no chunks of solid tallow in there, we are going to start adding a little bit of our meat powder at a time. You'll notice I started with a spatula. A whisk is really a better idea for this to break it down. So I grabbed my whisk. You're going to want to make sure that all of that meat dust is mixed in well. I showed you that it kind of sticks together when it gets really fine. So that's why this whisk is going to be really important. It's going to help break up the little clumps. You don't want any dry clumps of meat stuck in the middle of your pemmican. It's not going to be as delicious. So we're going to just keep following this process until we've eventually incorporated all of the meat powder. And you will notice as we go, we're going to keep whisking and mixing it in there really well. We've got our heat still on low, and you will notice that this mixture, as the meat melts into the fat, you'll notice that it starts to look like chocolate. Now we're going to add in some more of the meat powder. And as you add more meat powder, it's going to start to thicken up a lot more each time that you add some. Just make sure that you are mixing it in really, really well. We do not want any of those clumps in there. All right, now it's kind of getting to the point where it looks like a chocolate cake mix. Maybe it's still fairly thin, but you can definitely tell it's thickening up. Now we're going to add the last of it in there. We're going to get it mixed in there, and it's going to get pretty thick on this go around. It's actually going to start looking more like brownie batter. It's going to get pretty thick. Just again, make sure you're breaking up all of those clumps and getting that mixed in really well. Now at this point, this is a great time to taste it, see if it has enough salt in it or if you're adding any other seasonings or spices. This is also the time to add the dried fruits or the nuts if you're mixing that in, or honey if you're mixing in some honey. That's not going to be anything that I'm adding into mine. I'm actually going to be using crispy fried beef tendons in mine. I don't want them in all of my pemmican, so what I did is I just spread them out into the molds that I wanted them to be in. I'm measuring this out into 1 tablespoon scoops each, and that's all I'm putting in each of these molds. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually comes out to the perfect thickness. It's perfect for that cookie size and cookie texture. So you'll see I'm just scooping it out and putting on top of my little beef tendons here and just kind of making sure it gets pressed in there really good to get to the bottom of it. Once I get through with these, I'm going to show you what it's like scooping them into the ones without. So you'll notice, because our mix got really thick, it's pretty big clumps of this pemmican that's going in here. To get this to flatten out nicely in the bottom of your pan, it's easiest to just pick it up and slightly tap it or drop it lightly on the counter. It's going to spread right out, right into the bottom, all the corners of your silicone mold. This is how I do it for all of them. It works out great. Finishing it off now with a little bit of smoked salt. I think this one is the Redmond's Chef's Blend. It's absolutely delicious. I love to finish it off with the smoked salt. All right, we're gonna pop these suckers in the freezer for about 6 hours, and then they are going to be done for the most part. So I'm gonna show you what it's like getting these out of the silicone molds. This is why I like the silicone. It's very easy to peel them right out of there and put them into your container. You don't have to struggle with them getting stuck in the bottom of a hard metal muffin tin or anything like that. All right, so we have come to the end. I have got all of my delicious pemmican all ready to pack up and leave it in the freezer for a delicious treat. All right, guys, so here is time for the finished product. So this is the pemmican that has been sitting at room temperature. You see it is still nice and hard. It's still a solid piece. It looks like chocolate. All right, now I'm going to bite into that one and do a taste test with that, but I'm also going to show you These are the ones that are frozen. Looks like a piece of chocolate. And then I've also got these little round ones that I added these little crispy crunchies in. And this is actually beef tendons. I will make a video in the future on how I do the beef tendons. They are dehydrated and then fried, and they make these super crispy little pieces. You could probably use pork rinds in it if you are a person that can tolerate pork, and if you like the flavor of pork rinds. I think the beef tendons have a better flavor than the pork rinds, and I just absolutely love them. So here's what we have. So these are my frozen ones, and this is my shelf-stable one. Now the frozen ones, I'll bite into that one first. It has that crunch, and it's got this lovely texture. It's so good. Oh my gosh, I love these. All right, now the difference is this is the one that is sitting out at room temperature. It is very soft. It's still delicious, but it's a lot softer, and I don't really know how to describe the texture. It's just, it still has the crumbly bits that you get when you bite into the frozen one, so it still is kind of cookie-ish, but with that suet in there being at room temperature, it's almost a little bit of a waxier texture. I guess that's the best way I can describe it. That doesn't sound very appetizing. It tastes fine. It feels fine in the mouth. I just prefer them frozen. All right, now this one is the one with the beef tendons in it. These are my favorite. I have a hard time staying out of them. The reason I like to make these into the little small 1 tablespoon pieces is because think about Christmas time when you make cookies and your cookie jar is full of them and you just keep reaching and going back for more and more. If I make them really small, I don't feel guilty when I go and have more and more and more. Whereas if I had a massive bar of this, I would still go back for more. So this helps me portion control for myself. So I hope you guys make some pemmican. Try it for yourself. And I hope you love them as much as I do. They are just such a fantastic snack. I absolutely love them, and I hope you'll enjoy them as much as I do.
She's the friendly neighborhood carnivore with a talent for cooking up a meaty uproar. From juicy steaks to sizzling ribs galore, she'll have you coming back for more. Fellas, smash that like button. She's the carnivore cooking queen. On your screen, bringing the meaty scene. Come on over and join the team for a culinary dream.